The shot cracked across the Utah Valley University quad just after noon, and for a split, disbelieving moment, the crowd froze. Then the scene dissolved into shouts, ducking heads, and the scramble of bodies trying to get away from danger. Charlie Kirk, the conservative activist and co-founder of Turning Point USA,
after a prominent right-wing activist, Charlie Kirk, was shot dead while addressing students on a campus in Utah. Video footage showed Mr. Kirk, a close ally of Donald Trump, speaking and then slumping down in his seat.
Had been speaking as part of a campus stop on his American Comeback tour, when the sound of gunfire cut through the summer bright air in Orem, Utah on September 10, 2025. Amateur phone videos circulating online showed the chaos that followed: a flinch, a collapse, the flurry of security rushing the stage, and students sprinting across the lawn. By day's end, the incident had vaulted from a campus shock to a national flashpoint, as leaders from across the political spectrum reacted and investigators fanned out across the city and surrounding neighborhoods. Before we start, smash the like and subscribe buttons for more updates. Initial reports offered a jigsaw of details. Early dispatches emphasized that Kirk had been struck by a single round during an outdoor event near a tent branded with tour slogans, and that law enforcement believed the shot originated from some distance away, possibly a building hundreds of yards off. Eyewitness accounts describe blood at Kirk's neck and the gut-level disbelief that it was happening at all. One student told local television he first mistook the sound for confetti before seeing the wound. Within minutes, campus police and Kirk's private security detail had moved him to a vehicle and then to an area hospital, while university officials locked down parts of the campus and canceled classes. As is typical in such fast-moving tragedies, the information landscape shifted hour by hour. Some outlets reported that a suspect had been detained nearby, describing an older man in a blue shirt seen by witnesses. Others stressed that authorities were still pursuing a person of interest and asking the public for tips. Late in the evening and into the next day, federal agents from the FBI and ATF joined Utah authorities, who released images and appealed for help in tracking a person tied to the shooting. The result was a split screen of certainty and uncertainty. A well-known political figure gravely wounded, reported as deceased by some sources, in critical condition by others, while investigators worked to reconstruct a sniper-like shot fired into a crowded event. Even with details in flux, the overarching storyline hardened quickly. This was another eruption of political violence in an era that already felt saturated with it. Leaders from both parties condemned the shooting. Former President Donald Trump, a close ally of Kirk's, urged prayers and later memorialized him in stark terms. Prominent Republicans and Democrats alike cast the attack as a line that cannot be crossed in a constitutional democracy. Utah's governor and U.S. senators, along with national figures, expressed shock and solidarity with Kirk's family and the thousands of young people who had turned out to hear him. The bipartisan nature of the response, notable in a polarized season, underscored the country's unresolved anxiety about safety and public life. Within the campus community, the human texture of the day came through in small, searing recollections. One witness said the gunshot felt like it came from behind him. Another remembered the split-second shift from curiosity to survival. Grab a friend, duck, run, don't look back. Administrators moved to suspend activity and provide counseling resources, reminding students that even routine civic events can carry unpredictable risks. The campus police chief, speaking with the weary cadence of someone who has drilled for the worst and still been surprised by it, acknowledged the limits of preparation against a distant shooter with a clean line of sight. "We train for these things," he said. "And you think you have things covered?" Kirk's presence in Utah was no accident of scheduling. Over the past decade, the Turning Point USA founder has curated an outsized influence on the right, particularly among younger audiences who discover politics through social media clips and campus debates. His touring model, part rally, part town hall, part confrontation by design, relies on open-air accessibility. The Prove Me Wrong tables, with their provocation-laced placards, are engineered to attract argument and, by extension, attention. The same openness that serves the brand also creates vulnerabilities. Predictable locations, publicized times, and large crowds spread across lawns and quads. Campus venues have wrestled with this trade-off in recent years, balancing the First Amendment's promise with modern threat paradigms that look more like long-distance ambushes than the security screenings of an arena doorway. The shooting in Orem reverberated precisely because it spliced together those overlapping threads: political celebrity, youthful crowds, open campus spaces, a single shot fired from a vantage point that sidestepped the standard perimeter. In that sense, it calls to mind the unnerving portability of violence that law enforcement has warned about since the rise of lone actors armed with rifles and a plan. Investigations in such cases hinge on boring, relentless steps: retracing the shooter's approach, establishing lines of sight, scouring for ballistics, reconciling inconsistent witness statements, pulling surveillance footage, and picking through digital breadcrumbs. Federal assistance brings technical muscle: cell tower dumps, license plate readers, forensic timelines knitted from disparate data sources. The aim is not just to identify a suspect, but to map intention. Was this a politically motivated act? Was anyone else targeted? Was there online forewarning, a manifesto, a pattern of fixation? By Thursday morning, the FBI's public appeal signaled both urgency and the complexity of the hunt. Media coverage reflected the country's fragmented information ecosystem. Wire services pushed out terse, carefully sourced updates. National outlets, weaving together local briefings and social media video, offered context on Kirk's political prominence in the site's geography. Live blogs stitched everything together with real-time bursts of new details. Some headlines framed the situation as a manhunt for a killer, others as a critical injury with uncertain prognosis. The divergence was not evidence of deception so much as the familiar lag between what investigators know, what they can say, and how editors balance caution against the public's demand for clarity. Readers toggling across outlets encountered a landscape where the facts overlapped by 80%, and the remaining 20%, suspect in custody or not, fatal or not, mattered more than anything else. Political reactions came as swiftly as the first ambulance. Trump praised Kirk in sweeping terms and tied the shooting to a broader struggle over rhetoric and responsibility. Democrats, including Governors Josh Shapiro and Gavin Newsom and President Joe Biden, denounced the attack and emphasized a categorical rejection of violence in politics. That brief unity, real and necessary as it was, felt fragile. In the hours after the shooting, social platforms already seeded with tribal instincts began to fill with speculation and spin. Claims about the shooter's ideology, theories about security failures, insinuations about false flags. Federal briefings warned against circulating unverified images or drawing conclusions from stray pieces of evidence. The investigators' job was hard enough without a fog of viral certainty outpacing their careful chain of custody work. For Turning Point USA and the orbit of media enterprises around Kirk, his daily show, speaking engagements, and the constellation of campus chapters, the shock was also existential. The organization built its identity around confronting liberal orthodoxy in spaces historically dominated by it, and its signature tactic was proximity. Go where the audiences are, invite argument, record it all. That strategy now faces a cruel arithmetic. Public events carry public risk. Outdoor stages open to anyone carry more of it. In the aftermath, staff and allied groups will be forced to reconsider everything from venue selection to ingress routes to long gun sight lines from nearby rooftops. None of those are new considerations, but they feel different when a single shot has already proven every assumption wrong. Still, it would be a mistake to file the Orem shooting solely under the category of security failure or polarization. Both diagnoses say something true and not nearly enough. American civic life depends on the ability of public figures across ideologies to speak in shared spaces without accepting a background level of sniper risk. That requires layers. Better threat modeling by host institutions, yes, but also a social compact that turns down the temperature. The bipartisan condemnations suggest a widespread appetite for that. The problem, as ever, is how to make a sentiment durable. If recent years have taught anything, it is that cathartic statements after a high-profile attack rarely survive the next news cycle intact. Eyewitness testimony from the Utah Valley lawn painted a picture of micro-heroism amid fear. People dragged folding chairs aside to clear paths, pulled strangers behind pillars, shouted directions at one another over the ringing in their ears. Security personnel moved decisively, using vehicles as improvised shields and steering crowds toward exits least exposed to the suspected line of fire. Local hospitals activated protocols for mass casualty potentials even though the incident centered on a single victim. The emergency response was, by most accounts, fast. Yet, fast against a single distant gunman can feel like a semantic victory. The round has already done its work by the time the ambulance doors slam shut. What happens now depends on the investigation's next turns. If the suspect images lead to an arrest, prosecutors will have to draw a straight line from grievance to intent. They will sift devices for search histories, social posts, and message threads. They will look for practice sessions at ranges, purchases that telegraph premeditation, and any signs of co-conspirators. If instead the trail grows cold, the psychic wound can deepen. The idea that a public figure can be felled by a distant, unlocated shooter at a campus appearance is the sort of thing that chills open discourse even without the finality of a courtroom narrative. Either way, Utah's law enforcement community, in coordination with federal partners, will be measured by whether they can give the country not merely a name, but a story that makes sense of this one terrible moment. The conversation about prevention will widen. Universities have long navigated the balance between welcoming controversial speakers and safeguarding students. In recent years, that balance has leaned heavily into gatekeeping at entrances. Bag checks, magnetometers, ticketing, measures that do far less against a long-distance threat. Expect a rethinking. Topographical audits of venues for potential firing positions. Outreach to nearby building managers during events. Temporary closures of rooftops and high windows. Roving overwatch units, even the use of portable ballistic shields at podiums. Each step dampens spontaneity. Each is also, in the wake of Orem, likely to be considered basic due diligence for outdoor gatherings with public figures. It would be easy to cast Kirk's career as uniquely combustible and therefore uniquely risky. But the larger pattern suggests any high-profile figure, left, right, or apolitical celebrity, carries analogous vulnerabilities when appearing in porous spaces. The United States has experienced a string of attempts and attacks in recent years that cross ideological lines and blur motives. What binds them is not policy disagreement so much as a willingness to transform grievance into spectacle. That grim through line is why this shooting is not only a tragedy for one family and movement, but a stress test for a democracy's promise that persuasion, not force, should win the day. There will also be a reckoning inside conservative media. Kirk, whose platforms reach millions of listeners and viewers, built a brand on certitude and confrontation that energized supporters and infuriated opponents. In the immediate term, the void left in broadcast schedules and live events will be filled with tributes and re-airs. In the longer term, leaders in that ecosystem will face a choice about tone. Some will lean into escalation, framing the shooting as proof that politics is war. Others, including voices who condemn the attack across the aisle, will argue that the only workable response is to prove that politics can still be a contest of words, not weapons. Which argument wins will matter far beyond the ratings column. Meanwhile, students at Utah Valley will live with the memory that the quad where they toss frisbees and cram for finals became the scene of a national trauma. That recoloring is hard to shake. Alumni will return and instinctively glance up at the roofs. Campus tours will route around the spot without saying why. A generation of undergrads will share a story that begins, "I was there the day." Universities are resilient places, but they are also repositories of collective memory. It will be up to administrators, faculty, and student leaders to build rituals of remembrance that neither exploit the moment nor bury it in silence. For observers far from Utah, the question is what lesson to take. One version of the story focuses on security minutia and prescribes a technocratic fix. Another leans into political blame and prescribes more of the rhetoric that got us here. A third, harder path asks for a civic recommitment to pluralism that treats even sharp disagreement as a reason to show up, not to shut down. That is not a naive plea to be nice. It is a practical recognition that we cannot install enough metal detectors or station enough officers to harden every quad, park, courthouse step, and church hall where the American experiment actually happens. The most robust defense against political violence in the end is cultural, a norm that treats political losers as legitimate participants in a game that will be played again tomorrow. The days after Orem will be filled with press conferences and updates. Some will bring closure, others will reopen wounds. Conflicting reports about exactly what happened, a suspect in custody or a person of interest at large, a fatality confirmed, or a fight for life ongoing, will be reconciled into a timeline and a docket. Until then, the responsible posture is to hold the facts with an open hand. Investigators are sorting evidence that will either justify the strongest headlines or walk them back. The impulse to know everything immediately is understandable. It is also, in a case like this, a bad guide. There is a quieter story running beneath the clamor. The story of the people who made space for one another in the worst minute of their week. A student steadied a near stranger who couldn't stop shaking. A faculty member kept a doorway open and counted heads until the rush subsided. Event staff who will be second-guessed for months did the monotonous, necessary work of moving crowds away from lines of sight while the rest of us were watching the clip for the 15th time. These ordinary acts do not cancel out the violence. They do mark the boundaries of a community that refuses to let one bullet redraw its map. And then there is the family at the center. Kirk's wife and young children. Pulled into a vortex of cameras, statements, and legal process they did not choose. Whatever one thinks of Kirk's politics, there is a decency in leaving room for the personal amid the public. The prayers and condolences pouring in come from supporters and detractors alike, because grief at a life harmed or lost is not partisan. That space matters, not only for the family's sake, but because it models a way to be citizens together in a season that keeps daring us to become enemies. By the time the official investigative timeline emerges, we will know the shooter's name, the weapon used, the path of the shot, and the turns in the suspect's life that led to a trigger pull on a Utah afternoon. We will know whether an arrest came quickly or after a long chase, whether the motive was political, personal, or a web of both, whether there were missed signals and how institutions will adjust. What we cannot afford to forget, even then, is the baseline truth that a self-governing people must defend. Arguments are not threats, opponents are not enemies, and the campus lawn is not a battlefield. The nation will move on, as it always does. The question is what we will carry forward from Utah, a deeper fear, or a deeper resolve to keep showing up in public together. In the days following the shooting at Utah Valley University, the story of Charlie Kirk's public life collided with the tragedy in ways that reshaped how people thought about security, politics, and the fragility of open dialogue in America. What had begun as a tour stop designed to engage students with his distinctive blend of conservative activism suddenly became the subject of nationwide investigation and mourning. The story widened rapidly, pulling in not only the details of law enforcement's response, but also the deeper questions about why public discourse in the United States has come to feel increasingly unsafe. When news broke that Kirk had been struck during his appearance, Americans across the political spectrum found themselves confronting the reality that political violence, long a fear simmering beneath the surface, had once again stepped into the open. His prominence as a media personality made the story unavoidable, ensuring that it dominated television, radio, and online conversations for days. Analysts parsed every second of video footage, pointing out details such as the direction from which the bullet came, the speed of the medical response, and even the expressions on the faces of those near him when the shot rang out. Each of these fragments fed into a collective attempt to understand the unthinkable. Commentators also revisited the role Kirk had played in shaping conservative youth culture. He was not just a speaker, but a figure whose presence at campuses symbolized a challenge to liberal orthodoxy. This made the act of violence not only personal but also symbolic, raising fears about whether political opponents, no matter their ideology, might increasingly find themselves in the crosshairs of extremism. The symbolic dimension added an extra layer of urgency to the conversations unfolding in Congress, state legislatures, and local town halls. One of the most fascinating aspects of the days after the shooting was the way the media ecosystem revealed its fractures. On one hand, major outlets worked to verify information, carefully updating their stories as police released official briefings. On the other, social media spread unverified claims at lightning speed. Amateur videos were slowed down, zoomed in, and dissected by thousands of online sleuths, some of whom claimed to see additional shooters, while others insisted on conspiracy theories that pointed fingers at both the left and the right. The gap between what official channels reported and what ordinary citizens speculated about underscored the challenges of living in an information-saturated age. It was not enough for investigators to track down the shooter. They also had to contend with a torrent of misinformation that could cloud the public's perception of the truth. This secondary battle, between fact and rumor, became nearly as important as the physical manhunt for the suspect. The response from political leaders was swift and, initially, unusually unified. President Biden denounced the shooting in a statement that stressed the importance of rejecting violence as a political tool, framing the incident as a threat not only to Kirk, but to the very foundation of democratic society. Former President Trump, in contrast, couched his condemnation in both personal praise for Kirk and a sharper critique of the current political climate. Both men, despite their vast differences, recognized the need to project a message that violence against political figures cannot be tolerated. Across the aisle, governors, senators, and representatives echoed these sentiments, each trying to strike a balance between honoring Kirk and cautioning against escalation. Yet beneath the surface, the seeds of future division were visible. Some voices used the event to point to flaws in campus security, while others sought to connect the attack to the overheated nature of political rhetoric. The fragile unity of those first 24 hours was already showing signs of strain as partisanship seeped back into the discourse. As the FBI and local police intensified their search for the suspect, the details of the investigation revealed just how complex it is to handle an attack of this nature. Unlike mass shootings in enclosed spaces, this incident involved a single, carefully aimed shot from an unknown distance. Investigators had to map sight lines across multiple buildings, gather ballistic evidence that could link a specific weapon to the attack, and comb through hours of surveillance footage from campus security cameras, traffic lights, and nearby businesses. The level of forensic detail required highlighted the sophistication of modern investigations. Agents were not simply looking for a weapon, they were analyzing cell tower data to see if the suspect's phone had been in the area, reviewing purchases of rifles or ammunition in recent weeks, and checking online postings for signs of intent. These painstaking processes unfolded in the background even as the public clamored for quick answers. For students at Utah Valley University, the trauma was immediate and enduring. A campus that had been preparing for an ordinary event suddenly became the site of a national emergency. Some students were forced to shelter in place, their phones buzzing with frantic texts from parents who had seen the news. Others ran in blind panic, unsure of whether more shots would follow. Those closest to the stage were left with vivid memories of blood and chaos that would replay in their minds for years. University officials scrambled to provide mental health resources, setting up counseling centers and peer support groups. Professors adjusted syllabi to accommodate the shock that had swept through classrooms, acknowledging that learning could not simply resume as if nothing had happened. In conversations across campus, students asked hard questions about the limits of free expression and the price of open political dialogue. For many, the ideal of a college as a safe space for debate felt forever altered. While the public focused on the political and cultural implications of the attack, Kirk's family was pulled into the center of attention against their will. His wife and children were suddenly the subjects of constant media scrutiny, their private grief magnified by cameras and commentaries. Friends close to the family described the difficulty of balancing personal loss with the expectations of a public grieving process. The family's ordeal reminded many Americans that beneath the headlines and hashtags was a circle of loved ones navigating the most difficult days of their lives. Religious communities rallied around them, offering vigils, prayers, and donations. Conservative churches across the country dedicated services to Kirk's recovery and to condemning violence in politics. Even some progressive faith leaders, though critical of Kirk's politics, emphasized the moral imperative to stand against harm regardless of ideology. These gestures, small in the grand scheme, reinforce the idea that shared humanity can still surface in moments of crisis. The Orem shooting will likely become a watershed moment for how universities and organizations think about hosting public figures. Prior to this event, security planning often focused on crowd control and direct threats within an audience. After Orem, attention shifted sharply toward long-range threats from outside a venue. Universities began reviewing architectural vulnerabilities, from rooftop access points to windows overlooking quads. Security consultants spoke openly about the need for rethinking campus event design altogether, with an emphasis on enclosed, controlled environments. This shift poses uncomfortable questions. Will political debate on campuses become increasingly rare? confined to heavily policed auditoriums? Will spontaneous student engagement, so central to the college experience, be sacrificed in the name of safety? These questions extend beyond universities, touching every sphere where public life unfolds: parks, state fairs, street festivals, and even places of worship. The possibility of unseen long-distance threats casts a shadow that will not easily fade. Charlie Kirk was not only a political activist, but also a figure whose career was inseparable from the digital age. His daily show, viral clips, and constant engagement on platforms like X and Instagram meant that his reach extended far beyond physical rallies. In many ways, his influence lay in bridging online provocation with in-person events. The shooting forces a reconsideration of how online notoriety translates into real-world risk. Social media personalities across the spectrum took note. Progressive influencers who often found themselves at the center of online outrage realized they too could be vulnerable. Conservative commentators saw the attack as a chilling warning about the consequences of visibility. The blurring of lines between celebrity, activism, and vulnerability created a sense of unease across the influencer landscape. Many began discussing the need for security, even at small meetups, and acknowledging that the online spotlight can attract not only fans but also potential threats. One of the more subtle consequences of the attack is the way it may discourage people from entering public life altogether. If giving a speech on a campus lawn can end in tragedy, why risk it? Potential candidates, activists, and public servants may reconsider their aspirations. This hesitation threatens the vitality of democratic institutions, which depend on a constant renewal of leadership and voices willing to take risks for the public good. Seasoned politicians have long lived with the reality of threats, but what makes the Orem incident different is that it pierced the bubble of safety around routine civic engagement. A college campus, once imagined as a relatively safe environment, became the backdrop for a national tragedy. If that can happen there, it can happen anywhere. The chilling effect on civic participation may unfold gradually, expressed not in grand statements but in the quiet decisions of individuals to step back from public life. The Orem shooting inevitably drew comparisons to earlier moments of political violence in America's history. Journalists and historians pointed to the assassination attempts on figures like Ronald Reagan, the 2011 Tucson shooting that gravely injured Representative Gabby Giffords, and the 2023 attempt on Donald Trump. Each of these moments forced the country to reckon with the vulnerability of public figures and the dangers of unchecked rhetoric. What sets the Kirk incident apart is its setting: a university campus, an institution symbolizing the free exchange of ideas. That symbolism amplified the tragedy, casting it not just as an attack on one man, but on the ideal of open debate itself. The cultural aftermath of the attack rippled through music, art, and literature almost immediately. Protest songs emerged, some lamenting the climate of violence and others channeling anger into calls for resistance. Artists produced paintings and digital works depicting the chaos of the scene, the blur of students running, or the stark image of a lone speaker struck down mid-sentence. Writers began framing essays about the fragility of public spaces in an age of polarization. Culture, as always, became both a mirror and a balm, helping people process grief and fear. Internationally, the shooting was covered with a mix of horror and resignation. Allies of the United States expressed sympathy, while commentators in Europe and Asia noted the recurring theme of gun violence in American life. For many abroad, the incident confirmed stereotypes about the United States as a nation unable to control its proliferation of firearms. Foreign leaders emphasized solidarity, but also pointed to the need for systemic change. The global attention reminded Americans that their domestic tragedies are often seen as symptoms of broader dysfunctions, shaping the nation's reputation worldwide. In the weeks and months ahead, the focus will inevitably turn toward accountability and prevention. Investigators will release reports reconstructing the shooter's path, the security gaps, and the lessons learned. Politicians will debate new measures to protect public figures, though consensus on how to balance freedom and safety will remain elusive. Families, students, and ordinary citizens will continue grappling with the psychic wound left by the event. The questions raised by Orem about safety, free speech, political culture, and the human cost of polarization will linger long after the headlines fade. At its core, the shooting underscored the fragility of a society that depends on public trust and shared space. Whether Americans can rebuild that trust and whether they can continue to gather in common places without fear will define much of the nation's civic life in the years to come. The tragedy at Utah Valley University was not only a moment of violence, it was also a warning, a mirror, and a test of resilience. The answers will come not in a single verdict or report, but in the daily choices of citizens, leaders, and communities who must decide whether the experiment of open democracy is still worth the risk. If you liked this video, please give it a like and subscribe to our channel. Also, leave your comments below and tell us, what are your thoughts on Charlie Kirk's shooting? Expected outcome or twist? We want to hear from you. Thank you for watching and see you next time.